Welcome back to Carneades.org. Today we're going to be digging a bit deeper into the theory of consequentialism, looking at what I'm going to call the Map of Consequentialism. So, consequentialism is simply the claim that actions should be morally judged based on their consequences. This is a broad claim, and how exactly we judge those consequences depends on the version of consequentialism to which you subscribe. In this map, we will outline 10 independent distinctions which define various consequentialist positions. What that means is each of these distinctions, you can be on either side of it, independent of what you choose about all of the other distinctions. So there's hundreds and hundreds of different possible consequentialist positions, I think 1,024 or something like that, that will arise from all of these distinctions. Not all of them may make complete sense, but they will work independently of each other. Let's take a look. So, because consequentialism is very much defined by utilitarianism, all of these 10 distinctions, we're going to be looking at the choice that utilitarianism makes, that classical utilitarianism makes, and the choice that's kind of a divergence from utilitarianism. So in each of these pairings, you will have something that is utilitarian and something that is not utilitarian. If you make all the choices in the utilitarian direction, you have classical utilitarianism. If you make most of the choices in that direction, but you maybe make one or two in a different direction or stepping on the other side of that distinction, you'll have a type of consequentialism that is similar to classical utilitarianism, but has maybe one or two important differences. But you could also make all of the choices or most of the choices against classical utilitarianism, and you'll have a type of consequentialism that looks very, very different from that traditional utilitarianism that you might be familiar with. So, we're going to define those choices that are traditionally utilitarian with these kind of red titles, the black text, and being on this side of the map. And on the other side of the map, we'll have our non-utilitarian choices with black titles and red text. So let's get started. First off, we have a distinction between actual consequentialism and expected consequentialism. Actual consequentialism says that good is determined based on the actual consequences as opposed to the expected consequences. So an action is good if the things that actually happened were good, however you're defining good, and we'll get into some distinctions with that later. But if what actually happened turned out to be good, no matter what you expected, you could have made a really risky move that more likely than not was going to end in some negative or bad consequences. But if the actual consequences ended up working out for you, if you got lucky, your action was good. Expected consequentialism, on the other hand, goes the other way. Good is determined based on the expected or predicted consequences, not the actual ones. So this is saying that whatever your expectations were, or possibly whatever the expectations of kind of an objective observer were, that is how we're going to be judging the consequences. Even if things go horribly wrong, if you expected them to go right, or if there was a general expectation for an objective observer that they would go right, let's say they had a very high probability of going well, then your action would still be judged as good. The distinction between those two of is it your own personal judgment or kind of an objective observer's judgment is a distinction we'll get to in a second. But for now, we also have a distinction between hedonistic consequentialism, which says that pleasure is the only good that matters. You might be able to distinguish between a couple different kinds of pleasure, but generally speaking, hedonistic consequentialism says pleasure is the only good that we're going to be talking about. And pluralistic consequentialism, which says that there are a variety of things which are counted as good consequences. Now, you might say, well, there's another position here that says there's only one thing that's counted as a good consequence, but it's not pleasure. Sure, that's another reaction to utilitarianism, but a more common one is a pluralistic view where several different things are included as good consequences. You also have a distinction between direct consequentialism and rule consequentialism. Direct consequentialism is also known as act consequentialism sometimes, or act utilitarianism. This is saying that we're judging the consequences of the acts themselves. The thing that you are doing, those consequences is what we're judging, as opposed to general consequences based on the general rules. Okay? So this is contrasted with rule consequentialism or rule utilitarianism, which says we're going to take a set of rules. We're going to see what consequences following those rules generally arrive you at. And then the rules that provide the best consequences, however we're defining the best consequences depending on the other parts of this distinction, those rules are how we're going to assess your actions. So rule consequentialism kind of walks the line a little bit between standard consequentialism and deontology, because you are following rules, but the rules are judged based on the consequences of those rules. Usually it tips a little bit more into consequentialism and how we think about it, but technically under our definition it could go either way. There's also a distinction between maximizing consequentialism and improving consequentialism. Maximizing consequentialism says that to be good, an action must create the best possible consequences, not just above average possible consequences. So we see in this little diagram 5 different possible situations. We see the amount of good per capita in the people, and you see that there's, of these 5 choices, there's an average good that you might do, and the second choice is a little bit better than average. It's actually pretty good for a lot of people, but because it's not the best, if you're a maximizing consequentialist, you're going to say that choice is not good. You have to pick the choice that will maximize whatever it is you're talking about good. If that's happiness, if that's pleasure, if that's virtuous action, whatever that is, you have to maximize it. That's contrasted with improvement consequentialism, which is going to say that to be good, an action must create an improvement in the status quo or be above average, depending on how exactly you parse that distinction. So once again, we have a little diagram. Either the first or the second choice could be counted as good, at least in the average version of this, because those are above average for the possible choices that you could make. Or if it was an improvement in the status quo, and that's a little bit harder to define. But improvement is saying there's not just one course of action that's going to be the best. It's not just the maximum consequences we have to get. You can just get decent. You just have to do pretty well. Improvement consequentialism is going to be a little bit more lenient, whereas maximizing consequentialism is going to be more strict. We also have universal consequentialism. Universal consequentialism says that we're going to assess the good of a particular consequence based on its effect on everyone in our population or everyone in the world. Everyone's a part of this. Note that this is going to be different than saying that everyone counts the same. We're counting everyone, but that doesn't necessarily mean everyone's going to count the same. Particular consequentialism, on the other hand, says that consequences are assessed based on their impact on a subset of people. There's only a certain group of people that we're going to be counting the consequences for, or a certain group of animals, if you want to include other animals in this. Particular consequentialism says that there's a subset of everyone that we're looking at, whereas universal says we're looking at everybody. Evaluative consequentialism says that the only things we're allowed to judge the consequences on are their ethical or normative features. And depending on how we're judging that, we could say that pleasure is the only ethical feature we're looking at, or there's a lot of different ethical features we're looking at. But whatever features we're looking at, we have to count them as ethical or normative features. We can't be counting other things, such as other properties of the world that might exist that don't in some way fall under the heading of being an ethical criterion. That's contrasted, of course, with non-evaluative consequentialism, which is going to say that consequences may be assessed on non-normative features. That's not saying they have to be, or that non-normative features are the only features we're going to assess them on, but some of the features can be non-normative. Some of the features could have to do with other features of the world that we might want or think are important, but we wouldn't count as kind of good or bad. Now, equal consequentialism is what I was contrasting a second ago with universal. So Equal consequentialism says that no one individual counts more or less than another. This is importantly different than universal consequentialism, which is saying we're counting everyone, but not everyone has to count the same. Equal consequentialism is saying that of the people we're counting, we could be universal in counting everybody, or we could be particular and only counting a subset, but of those people that we're counting, everyone has to count the same. So you could have an equal and particular consequentialism that only counted a subset of people, but everyone counted the same. And on the other side, you could have a privileged consequentialism. Privileged consequentialism is going to say that good consequences for some individuals count more than the same consequences for other individuals. That is universal. So you might count the consequences for everyone, but count them slightly differently. This might come into play when you're talking about the difference between humans or animals. You might say that humans count more than animals. Human pain and suffering counts more than animal pain and suffering. Or you might parse that distinction instead of you might keep equal, but parse it in terms of the universal and the particular, saying that, well, instead we're going to say just particular as a subgroup. We're only going to count the goodness as it pertains to humans. We're not going to count animals. So there's a couple different ways to parse that distinction. It's important to note with this, and I should have noted this at the beginning, any of these criteria can be taken independently. None of these particular criteria entail each other. Some of them may look a little strange if you pick one but not the other, but you can have, as we just noted, a privileged, which is completely separate from a particular type of consequentialism, and you can have an equal that isn't necessarily a universal consequentialism. So all of these choices are independent of each other. You also can have an agent-neutral consequentialism. This is something we were talking about briefly when we touched on the difference between actual and expected consequentialism. So agent-neutral consequentialism is going to say that observers and agents should assess the consequences of an action the same. So if you're working with expected consequentialism and you want something to be agent-neutral, you need to be talking about those expectations in terms of something that we all have access to, not something that just exists in your head. It needs to be something that both the agent would assess the consequences and the observer would assess the consequences the same. So if the agent and the observer assess those expected consequences differently, it's not going to be an agent-neutral consequentialism. It's going to be an agent-relative consequentialism, where consequences of an action vary based on the agent or the observer. As I said, this is a great example in the expected consequentialism, where agent-relative could be, for example, I assess the consequences to be good, but an objective observer might assess the more likely consequences to be bad. You also have aggregate consequentialism. Aggregate consequentialism is talking about how we do the counting of a good action versus a bad action, how we figure out which actions are the good ones and which ones are not. Aggregate is going to say the way we determine that is based on the features of that particular act or the features of those particular consequences of that act. It's not about kind of a general ranking of possible worlds or situations that would arise from that act. And of course, this is contrasted with overall consequentialism, which says that goodness is determined by an overall ranking of possible worlds or sets of consequences. So in this situation, instead of kind of counting up the numbers of this particular consequence versus that particular consequence, you have a list of the possible worlds and which of those worlds are better or worse than each other, and your choices end you in a particular possible world, and so you need to make your choices based on where that possible world ranks as opposed to where those consequences, how much those consequences add up together based on the features of those consequences, not the features of the whole world. And finally, we come to total consequentialism. Total consequentialism is good is determined by the sum of all of the consequences for everyone. And that's opposed to average consequentialism. Average consequentialism is good is determined by the mean positive consequences, or just generally the mean consequences, the average consequences for all that are affected. So these can compare, you might add up for total a lot of different very small positive consequences and find that would be greater than a single really good consequence for a single person, whereas for average, that single good consequence for that single person, because it's only affecting them, is going to be a better result because you're dividing it by less total people. Okay? So that might be one way that distinction plays. Once again, all of these 10 different distinctions are independent of each other. You can pick and choose as you like. Go ahead, create your own consequentialism. If I'm doing the math right, there should be about 1,024 different ways you can combine these. I can't promise all of them will make sense, but give it a try, see what makes sense, and here is the map of consequentialism. Watch this video and more here at Carneades.org, and stay skeptical, everybody.